Hello everyone, welcome back to the JavaScript course. I apologize for this being posted so late in the week. I usually try to keep it to Sunday, Monday, but as this is being posted on Tuesday, I will be pushing the due date for the homework number 7 to next week, Tuesday. And I'll mention that again at the end of this and include it in the announcement that I'll post when I post the lecture. So let's jump right into chapter 8, and this is where we start seeing jQuery for the first time. So jQuery is a library of a bunch of selectors, methods, attributes for you to just be able to use that is just built to make your life easier coding in JavaScript. And it has its own website. It is just jQuery.com, and there is documentation for everything that is in the library on that website, and that is also where you can download it, but you don't have to download it to your computer if you want to import the jQuery library into your application. But if you do want to be able to run an application on your own computer without a connection to the internet, then you would have to download the jQuery library. And just to show you, this is the jQuery website, just jQuery.com. There is the download tab where you can download it if you'd like to, but for the purposes of this class, we can always just import it directly through a CDN. So as long as you have an internet connection, you can load and run your web applications that use jQuery. And then this API documentation tab is useful to you for this class to just check what parameters do certain methods need, how do I use it, what exactly does it do. You can always search the jQuery documentation, or you could always just browse. For example, and I'll come back to this once we go over some of these things, but one of these things that it's really helpful is the traversing and the tree traversal. This is all of the methods that you can use to traverse the DOM tree. So like getting the children of elements, finding descendants, getting the next sibling, getting the parent, so on. So it's set up pretty well for search and also for browsing categories of what these selectors and methods do. So to summarize, jQuery is a library with a bunch of selectors, methods, and event methods to make writing JavaScript programs easier. It does load very quickly, so it doesn't degrade the performance of a JavaScript application. It works in many browsers, and the CSS selectors are compliant with CSS 3. And if you want to be able to use jQuery in your JavaScript file, all you need to do is include one of these script tags in your HTML file. So after your script tag that includes your JavaScript file that you're writing in your HTML, after that you can also include jQuery in that as well, so that everything is imported and loaded when the DOM is loaded, when your page is running. And this first one here is how to import the full library So everything, all of the methods and selectors that are there, this will import it. But for a lot of applications, the slim version will work just as well. The slim version is not the entire library, but pretty much just the most important bits, so that this will load faster because it's a smaller file to import. The most powerful part of jQuery is the jQuery selector. So we have already gotten a little bit of practice in using the jQuery selector without actually importing jQuery, because on several files that we've seen so far, there's been included a definition of this $sign function in our program. But now if we import jQuery, we don't have to define this $sign function. This $sign function is defined in the jQuery library. And this is the equivalent of just typing jQuery and then with parentheses and putting your selector in quotes inside of the parentheses. These two will do the same thing of just look through the DOM for a element that matches that selector. But the $sign is, faster to type than typing out jQuery every single time that you want to get something from the HTML page. So you already know how to use the $sign function to select elements from the DOM to be able to do things with them. We have been able to do that already, but most of the time it's usually just selecting an element using a single ID selector, and your book goes into a couple of special selectors we have seen already, as well as some new ones for jQuery. So this first one is an example of selecting all descendants. So this would select all paragraph elements that are descendants of the element with the ID FAQs. So this would include, some element with an ID FAQs. It could be a direct descendant, some element with a paragraph tag, but it could also be any further descendants as well. So anything directly connected to and lower than the element with ID FAQs, any of those paragraph elements, they will all be selected by this. But if we do want to say, I only want to look at direct children and not just all descendants, you can use the greater than in between two selectors. So this would get all UL or UL elements that are direct children of any div elements. So this would have to be this sort of relationship. So if there was a further descendant, this one would get included by the selector, this one would not. So this just gets direct children that are one level below. And jQuery also has special selectors for selecting siblings. So, for example, this selector, using the plus operator here between two selectors, it will get adjacent siblings. So this will get all div elements that are adjacent siblings of H2 elements. So any div elements that are right next to and on the same level as an H2 element. And then general siblings are just have to be on the same level and have the same parent, but don't have to be, touching each other in the HTML document. So for example, this selector would select all paragraph elements that are just general siblings of UL elements. So for example, if we had some parent and then there's an H2 and a div next to each other. Let's say there's another div element here. This div element would be selected and this div element would not be selected in this case because it's getting all div elements that are adjacent to H2 elements. But if we had something like this, both of these paragraph elements would be selected since they are both just general siblings of this UL element here. So all of these here are useful for when you do want to select multiple elements because it will give you back all of the elements that satisfy these selectors. So if you wanted to get all of the elements that satisfy one of these selectors and then go through them and do something with them, then using these selectors would be a good way to do that. But if you just get one, if you are just looking for one, or even if you do select multiple things, you can apply a jQuery method to any elements that you select here. And so we can just chain that with the dot notation, and then depending on the method, it may need some parameters. So we've kind of seen this sort of syntax already for using methods. So some methods that are common are the value method. You can use that to both get a value or set a value. So in this example, this is selecting the element with the ID gallons and then getting the value that's at that element. So in this example, this is like considering that it's an input element and then taking whatever that value is and storing it in this constant gallons. But you can also use the value method to set a value, and this actually has a typo. I need quotes here. If you want to set a value, that takes a parameter. So if we, instead of just getting the value with nothing in the parentheses, that will just return whatever value is there. If we want to set it, then we have to put something inside of the parentheses that we want to set the value to. So this would set the value for the input element with the ID gallons to the empty string. So this would essentially clear the value for that input element. And another example of one of the methods is the text method for jQuery, where you can set the text value of an element. So selecting the element with the ID email error and then setting the text to this string literal. All we have to do is pass that string into the text method as a parameter to be able to do that. And we can also chain methods together, and the execution will just happen in order. So this, using the dot notation, this is technically chaining already, because this is one function and then we're chaining another method or function onto the result. So this is just two of those, so two sets of that dot notation. So this will select the element with the ID last name, then dot next will take that element and return the next sibling of that element. And then once we have that next sibling element, the dot text method will set the text of the sibling element we now have to this string literal last name is required. So you can string together as many methods as you want, as long as you understand what each method is doing and making sure that a method is going to return something that you can then use the dot notation with another method. Because, for example, dot text needs the dot to be put on something that is an element, and the next method will give you an element. It gives you the next sibling element. Another useful method is the submit method, which you can use to submit a form. So if a form has the ID join list, then we could use a selector to get that, and then just put .submit to submit the form. And .focus is one that we've seen before to set the focus of a form control or a link, something that we can give the focus to. So up to this point, you may be thinking, this kind of just looks like things we've already been able to do already. But the jQuery event methods is really where we get into, oh, this makes my life a lot easier when I'm writing a JavaScript application. So an event method will attach, you can use to attach an event handler for you without having to use the add query selector. What it was called? Let me double check real quick. Add event listener was what I was looking for. I was getting that mixed up with the query selector. So, for example, and I'm going to show this on the screen again later, but these two JavaScript files do the same thing, but this is just base JavaScript and this is using jQuery. And here we can see we have the add event listener, but using jQuery, we can just select the document, and you can put just objects inside of the jQuery $ function, and it will just, you can use that to select that element. And the .ready method is an event method that is equivalent to attaching an event listener to the DOM content loaded event. But you don't have to remember the name of the event. You just need to know that .ready is the name of the event method, and then in the parentheses for that method, you can just put the event handler, so what you want to happen when the DOM is ready. And similarly, .click is an event method. And the great thing here is that you can select multiple elements. So this selects all H2 elements that are descendants of the element with the FAQs tag, and it attaches a click event handler for every single one of those elements. So this is just one, we just have to define this event handler function once, and it gets applied to the click event for all of these elements that are selected by this selector. Whereas in just regular JavaScript, we have to select all of those, and because we don't have a nice fancy method, we have to go through all of those elements and individually add an event listener for each one. So the event methods can be applied to many elements. So if you have a selector that selects multiple elements, you still can just do a .event method to apply that event handler to all of the elements selected, so that you don't have to loop through all of your elements and individually apply event listeners. So here is that syntax again, just general syntax for event methods, where all you need to know is the event method name, and you can use that find that by looking in your book or the documentation on jQuery.com to find what event method name you need to attach your event handler to the correct event. And it's common to just use anonymous functions, just anonymous arrow functions inside of the parentheses here, but you can still code your own functions and use that as a parameter as well. So here's another example of that .ready event method for the document, and then the click event method. So this will attach this function to the click event for all of the H2 elements. So your book presents a lot of useful selectors, methods, and event methods for you to be able to use. And in programming, it is not expected for you to just memorize every single little thing, every single function and what parameters it needs. That kind of just happens naturally. You will remember the details for methods that you use all the time, and then a method that you don't use often, you will probably have to go to the documentation and look it up and verify that it does what you need it to do and you're using it correctly. So the big thing I want you to take away from those most useful lists is just the ability to look up what you need to do. So if you need to retrieve some elements from the HTML, from the DOM, you'll want to use a selector for that. And if you need to access a value from an element once you have an element, or make some sort of modification to an element once you have it, you'll want to use a jQuery method and look through those to see what ones might perform the action that you want to occur. And then if you need to attach an event handler to a certain event for a specific element, you'll want to look at the event methods and look through those to see what event methods will, correspond to the event that I want to attach an event handler to. Now, we have seen the event object before, where we have written event handlers that take a single parameter for the event, and we have used the event.prevent default to stop the default, like what happens by default when that event happens, to stop that action from being performed. But the textbook, this chapter, also brings up the event.currentTarget. The current target attribute is very useful so that you can just access the element that the event is occurring on inside of your event handler. So you won't have to use the selector again to try to get to that element. As long as you have the event, you can, inside of your event handler, just put event.currentTarget to get the element that that event is happening on. So, for example, if this was a click event, then we could use event.currentTarget to get the exact element that was clicked on that triggered this event handler. So the event methods that are in that list of most useful jQuery event methods in your textbook, those just take the event handler, that function, as a parameter. So, for example, if I go back to this, like the ready event method and the click event method, the only things inside of the parentheses for each of those methods is the function, is the event handler. But these special jQuery event methods, they take in both, or at least an event, like what events like click are happening, and handlers. And so these are kind of, you can consider like meta event methods. So the on event method you can just use to attach an event handler to one or more events. So it is pretty much just a quicker version of the add event listener, of just being able to put .on, and then you can do multiple events. So you could have, click and double click, and then just put your handler in once. And off removes an event handler from one or more events. And one attaches an event handler and then removes it after that event handler runs one time. So this can be useful if you only want an event to be able to happen once, but that element stays on the page. So you might have like a button that you only want to be able to be clicked once, and after that you don't want any more click events happening. Then you wouldn't have to worry about attaching it and then removing it once it runs once. This will just set everything up for you for that to happen. And then you can use the trigger event method to trigger an event for the selected element. So all of these will still have, a selector, a $, parentheses, and then a dot in front of all of these when you use them. So they will pertain to an element. Now, to round out talking about Chapter 8 before we get into Chapter 9 content, I wanted to go through one of the examples that are in your textbook, because sometimes it can be a little difficult just following along in the textbook, so I kind of wanted to talk through it. So the FAQs application you should be pretty familiar with by now because we've seen it a couple times already, where we can click on these links to expand and collapse the div elements that have the text below them. So your textbook goes over how that could be converted into using jQuery. So the HTML for this looks the same, I would say, as what we have seen already, with just defining the elements. But we can see down here, we import the jQuery and import our JavaScript. And I may have misspoke earlier. You do want to import your JavaScript first before importing your JavaScript, if your JavaScript uses jQuery in order to work, which that should be the case if you are importing jQuery at all. So make sure you do that first, just so that there aren't any issues with loading. JavaScript will be loaded first so that there won't be any issues with your JavaScript not being able to use or find what it needs from the Java or jQuery library. So let's talk through the JavaScript for this that uses jQuery. So we have our document.ready. This is our event handler this is going to attach our event handler for when the DOM is ready. And so when the DOM is ready is when we want to set up everything else. And what we want to do is set click event handlers. So we don't have to select all of the H2 tags and then loop through them. We just have to use a selector that will give us all of those H2 tags, and then use the .click event method to attach the click event handler to the click event for any of the elements that are returned by this selector. So the actual event handler function for the click event that will be applied to all of the H2 tags, because we want to access the actual H2 element, and because we also want to prevent the default action from happening, we have our event parameter here instead of just having empty parentheses here. And we can use that to get the current target of the event, so the actual element that was clicked on that triggered this click event, that is our H2 element that we can use to access and modify everything else that we need to for this application. And this application uses the class, whether or not the element has the minus as a class, to kind of signify whether or not there's a minus or a plus in front of the H2, in front of the header. So, for example, right now, this first H2 element would have a minus as one of its classes, but these other H2 elements would not, because they are not expanded. So that class is just used to keep track of whether or not it's already expanded. And we can just use the toggle class on our H2 element to toggle whether or not that minus is there in our class attribute. So if it's there, toggle class will remove it, and if it's not there, it will add it for us. And once we have updated that class, now whether or not that minus class is there will determine what, if that H2 div element below it should be expanded or not. So we have our if else here that checks if the class attribute is not minus, that means that it should not be expanded. Then we can take our H2 element, get the next sibling, which if we look, any H2 element we have, the next sibling would be the corresponding div element. So, and for this H2 element, the div element that we would want to expand or collapse or, show or hide, that would be the next sibling. So the way that we have our HTML set up is why we can use the next method to just get to that div element. And then the hide method will make it so that div element is not showing anymore. And then for our else block, this means that we did just set the class to minus, which means that we do want the div element to show. We want that to be expanded. So in that case, we want to get our H2 element, get the next sibling, which will be that div element, and then show that div element. And then finally, we want to make sure that we prevent the default event from happening, because this click event is really happening because we have a link inside of our H2 tag. So a click event is happening because we have a link inside of that element. So it will register as being clicked on, but the default event or the default action for the click event for a link is to go to the web page that is in this href, which there's just kind of a placeholder there because we don't actually want to go to any new web pages. We just want to be showing and hiding these div elements. So we want to suppress that default action from happening anytime one of those links is clicked. So we want to make sure that we have this line in our function somewhere in our event handler. So that is setting up all of the click event handlers for all of the H2 tags. And this last part, so this is what will happen last when the DOM is ready. So this will just happen once. And let's talk through exactly what happens, because it's setting the focus of something. So this will get the element with ID FAQs. And if we go to our HTML, that is this main element. And this element starts here and goes all the way down to the bottom. That is the end of this tag. So it's our main body of our file. So it includes, it really has everything below it. So that main element, I don't need to have the CSS open. So this gets our main element, And then once we have that element, the .find method will look through the descendants of that element, searching for elements where this selector matches. So this first part here, just this A, it means that it's looking through, we're looking through the descendants of that main element, and we're looking for A tags. We're looking for links in all of the descendants. And then this colon first means that we just want to select the first one that we find. So looking through the descendants of this, it'll look at the H1 tag and say, that's not it. It'll look at the H2 tag, that's not it. And then burrowing further down, this A tag inside of the H2 element is the first link that we will come across. And so this link that's the element that gets returned by the find method. And so that first link, that first A tag, that is what gets the focus. So let's see if we can tell what that looks like. So when we load the application, we can see that that first link, it has a box around it. The text is blue, so that has the focus. And we can see, if we hover over other things, that will change the color there, because since those are links as well. But that first element, that first link, is given the focus when the web page is first loaded. And I just clicked off on my other screen. That's why that went away, so don't be alarmed by that. So that was Chapter 8 content. So let's move on to Chapter 9. This is a little bit more succinct, a little bit more concise, not as broad. So Chapter 9 goes a little bit quicker because it's a little bit more specific in how you use these things. So Chapter 9 is all about effects and animations. So the jQuery effect methods, the syntax is, using the method name and then in parentheses, because it's a method, it's like a function. Inside of those parentheses, anywhere where there's square brackets, that kind of just means that it's optional. So the duration in milliseconds, you can optionally pass in as a parameter, and that will be the duration of how long you want that effect to happen from beginning to end. And also optionally, you can, after the duration, use a comma and then put a callback function. So that is a function that you would want to execute when the effect is done happening. So after the duration, you can pass in a callback function that you want to execute when the effect is done. But it is more common to, instead of using a callback function inside of the parentheses of an effect method, you can just chain them. And we'll see examples of that actually right here. So instead of getting an element doing the fade out effect on it and potentially passing in the slide down method as a callback function, because we would have to select this over again in that case, we can instead just chain them together. So this will, get this element, make it fade out over 5 seconds, and then this second method won't start until this one is done. So effectively using a callback inside of one effect to apply another effect is the same. It'll have the same effect as just chaining together multiple effects, because they will just happen one after another. So after that fade out, then this slide down over 1 second will occur. So this will make the element disappear over the course of 5 seconds and then show back up, display again in 1 second after that. And the fade to effect method is a special one that requires a duration and also requires an opacity parameter. So you do need to give it a duration in milliseconds, and you also have to give it an opacity, which is a value between 0 and 1. How transparent or opaque do you want it to be, with 0 being completely invisible and 1 being completely opaque. It's completely there. Now you can create your own, kind of tailor your own effects using the animate method. So you can set up, what you want your final CSS properties to be inside curly braces for your first parameter, and it could be your only parameter, to the animate method. And then optionally you can add a duration. So how long do you want the animation to happen? And your web browser will kind of smartly figure out what changes it needs to incrementally make in order to go from the element's current state to what you want the ending, CSS style to be for that element. It will make those changes, animate those changes for you over that duration. And you can also have a callback function for the animate method as well. Or you can chain multiple animate methods just like any of the effect methods. So here's an example that selects any H1 elements that are descendants of the FAQs ID, the element with the FAQs ID, and it starts an animation to change the CSS to a font size of 275%, the opacity to 1, and this left property to 0. So inside of these curly braces is CSS. So kind of the properties that you would see in a CSS file are exactly how you set them up in this properties parameter with curly braces. And then there's a duration here of 2 seconds as well. And so we talked a little bit about how if you chain these methods and you have one after another, they will wait until one is finished before going on to the next one. So depending on how many you have coded, you are really setting up a queue of effects and animations. So both of these examples are accomplishing the same thing. So this first one is chaining together 2 animate method calls on this one selector. And in this example, it's just having them be completely separate. So selecting the element, animating it, and then we have a semicolon, the end of the code statement. And then after that, selecting that same element and animating it with a different animation. this is still going to cue those animations. This second one will not start until this first one is done. Similarly, this second animation here that's chained after this first one, this animation will not start until this first animation is complete. So when you have multiple, effect method calls or animate calls, and that cue is set up, there are methods that you can use to affect the cue. So there's the delay method that delays the start of the next animation in the cue. That takes a duration, how long you want to delay the animation for a specific element for. And there's also the stop method that stops the current animation for the selected elements. And there are optional parameters for these that are both Booleans. So by default, they are both false if you don't pass anything into the stop method. But if they are true, so this first one, if you do put true inside of the parentheses for the stop method, that will clear the cue. So it will stop the current animation and also prevent any of the other ones that are set up in the queue from happening. It completely clears them so they won't happen. And then this second parameter will cause the current animation to be completed immediately. So it jumps. So the jump to end means that for the current animation, it will just immediately complete it, jump to the end of the current animation. And then the finish method that you can use for an element is to stop the current animation for the selected element, clear the queue, and complete all animations so that you just get to the finished product immediately. Now, easings in jQuery are keywords that you can use to kind of dictate how that animation is going to be performed. Is it just going to be, continuous and smooth? Is it going to accelerate as it goes? Is it going to kind of do a little bounce at the end? And just base jQuery, it just has two easings, the linear easing and the swing easing. The linear is just a continuous one velocity the whole time animation, while the swing easing makes it's kind of hard to describe. It just is it's not all just kind of one almost monotonous way of doing the animation over that period of time, but it changes the velocity as it goes, so that it kind of starts up, eases into it, and also kind of slows down at the end too. So it's kind of a smooth animation. And that swing easing is the default for jQuery effects and animations. But there are also a bunch of other easings. But if you want to use those, that is something that you have to import as a plugin. So just like we have to import jQuery, if you want to use other easings, you will also have to import that in a script element in your HTML file to be able to use that in your JavaScript file. So And with any of our methods, it basically, goes at the end. It's the final parameter unless you have a callback function. It would go before that in your list of parameters. But as long as you don't have a callback, it will just be the final parameter in your parameter list. And this is the official website for that easing plugin, and this URL is in your textbook in the section about easings. And what is fun about this website is that there is a demonstration section where you can select easings out of the full list of easings that are in this plugin and see them, what the animations correspond to. So these animations are they're set up. The easings will apply to this box, this gray box, stretching down and then coming back up. So the first easing will be for the down animation, and the second easing is for the up animation. So if I click on this, we can view what these easings do to the animation. So if I click on it, when it goes out, it, just goes out pretty smoothly, but when it comes back in, it has that bounce applied to it. So we can do other things, you can, set whatever you'd like to just play around and see what the animation would look like. And so you can look at these easings and also try them out yourself in your own JavaScript page to see how those apply to the elements that you are setting up your own animations for. Now for the animate method, we already know that we pass in as the first parameter to the method inside curly braces the final CSS properties that we want the element to have. But we can also pass in a second set of curly braces with some advanced options. And so some of these options include the duration, the easing, a callback function to run when the animation is complete, a function to call for each step that the animation is broken into, and there are some other options as well that you can choose from. And similarly to how we had some methods where we could affect the queue for effects, there are also ways that we can work with the queue of animate methods as well. So there is the queue method that will have a little bit of a different impact depending on what parameters you give it. And then there's also dequeue and clear queue. So if you just call queue, that will get the queue for the selected element. But if you pass in a new queue, so if you set up, your own queue, or if you get a queue from another element, you can replace a queue for a selected element with a new queue. And you can also add a callback function to the end of a queue. And then dequeue will run the next item in the queue, and clear queue will remove all items that haven't yet been run from the queue. So our basic learning objectives for this week, the big things that I want you to take away are you should know how to import jQuery into your application. You should understand how to use jQuery selectors, methods, and event methods. And at the very least, you should, know what you need to accomplish and know where you can look to find selectors, methods, or event methods that you need to accomplish what you need to for your application. And then you should be able to call jQuery effects and animate methods to, apply effects and animations to elements in your web page. And you should understand how to chain methods together, and that any methods that you chain together in one code statement, they will be executed one after another. So if it's jQuery, just regular methods to find another element and then chain another method to do something to that element, knowing how to chain methods that way, but also chaining effects or chaining animate methods will set up that animation queue for multiple animations to be performed on an element. So that is all of our content, and I will change this. I changed it below, but I will also change it here in the heading here to remove that ambiguity. So I have pushed our due date for this week to next Tuesday because this lecture is going up so late. Again, I apologize for that. So homework number 7 is going to be due on Tuesday, and I typed in the wrong number again. It is the 29th, right? Yes, the 29th. It'll be right when the slides get posted. There we go. So Tuesday, October 29th at 11:59 p.m. I should have those due dates changed in Blackboard by the time this lecture is uploaded. So by this point, those due dates should be changed for you. You should be able to see that for homework number 7. And there are just 2 exercises for homework number 7, one from chapter 8 and one from chapter 9. The chapter 8 one is a little bit intensive because you start from scratch with a JavaScript file, kind of just an empty JavaScript file. But, feel free to look at other code as, templates to kind of help you set up what you need to set up for your file. And then the chapter 9 exercise for the homework is really just playing with the animations. So as far as grading, I'm not going to be super concerned with the content of that, just really that you made some changes to that file as evidence that you did play around with animations. And so that is our only assignment for this week. As always, email me with any questions, and also I'll make sure that there's a homework help discussion set up for homework number 7, and I'll check it at least once a day up until the due date. So thank you for your time, and let me know if you have any questions, and have a good week.